Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us for our annual summit today. It's titled The Future of Education. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Collaborative for Student Success, for their support of today's discussions. Look, the pandemic disrupted the education sector like no other. 2 years later, students, educators, and parents, everyone who interacts with the K-12 education system is still trying to catch up. To combat the learning loss experienced by students, the federal government is providing billions of dollars in relief funds to school districts across the country. Today's summit's going to take a look at how these funds are being used to advance education. What are we learning from how they're being used? What are the frontline data insights we're getting? We're going to ask if these initiatives that show promise and can be replicated across the country. We're also going to dive into issues related to equity and access. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. As usual, you can tweet us at The Hill Offense using the hashtag, and that's the most important thing, hashtag TheHillEd. That's The Hill ED. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, if it goes bad on you, don't throw your computer out the window. Just push refresh, refresh the page, and they tell me it will all work for you. My first guest today is the highest education official in the land. He's Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, and he's overseeing the distribution of funds under the American Rescue Plan to support K-12 and college education. We've talked before. He's a great friend of the Hill. Secretary Cardona, great to see you. Look, I often, I don't like to, get cliched about this, but there is this notion that sometimes when you have a crisis, it gives you an opportunity to make things better, to come out on the other end. I know that's been a priority of yours. Tell us what the most important issues are for you as we still try to get through this pandemic and make sure that we're not leaving a generation of people in schools behind or with a less, robust experience that they might otherwise have had.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve. Happy to be here. And you're absolutely right. I do think this is an opportunity for our country. And you know what? It would be a shame if we went back to the system that we had in March 2020, where so many of our students weren't finding success. I think, with the resources, with the level of urgency that we experienced over the last couple of years, we should be making our schools better. For the last 2 years, we focused on COVID. And for the next 2 years, we're going to be focusing on addressing complacency. I'm more worried about complacency than I am about COVID. We have our buildings open. Our educators have done a great job really bending over backwards to make sure that our schools are open. We went from 46% last year at this time to over 99% now. So now we've got to focus on recovery and making it better than it was before. And, American Rescue Plan funds can help kickstart that in a major way. And that's what I'm looking forward to seeing.
The other day, Randy Weingarten tweeted out this tweet, and I retweeted it, but I put a headline on it. Randy Weingarten, our folks, is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and they were telling the story of how they were trying to help thousands of teachers around the country get resources for their schools. And I said, hey, isn't it great that teachers kind of go into their own pocket, and isn't it heroic that they help, provide money out of their own funds to help it? And I said, wait, that's terrible. Why aren't we doing more to help these teachers on the front line with this? And so I'd love to hear from you. Are we gonna somehow correct the era where teachers who often are underpaid, a lot of responsibility on their shoulders, underappreciated, are going into their own pocket, to provide resources for their kids?
I'm getting mad just listening to the question. I'll be honest with you, Steve. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. But that goes to show the culture that we have in this country. Do more with less. Take out of your pocket, or spend 3 hours of your family time planning or getting professional development on something that you should be learning in school. We got to change that culture. We've normalized it. Put it all on the teacher, right? It cannot be that way moving forward. We have the American Rescue Plan where in this day and age for a teacher to be spending money out of their pocket to get something for students when we have millions of dollars in the coffers is unacceptable. So we have to get that money into the classrooms right away. But I think it goes beyond the American Rescue Plan. We've pushed forward really hard the president's budget for FY22, and we just got the omnibus, and we're setting up our FY23 budget now to make sure that we're changing the culture. But it can't just be the federal government. If our states and our local leaders they realize the importance of schools, because when they were shut down, everything else shut down. So let's make sure that we're supporting our educators and making it a profession where people want to go in. It's no surprise to me that we have shortages when we're talking about expecting teachers to take out of their own pocket for basic supplies. That's unacceptable.
You know, the other thing we're trying to do today is to realize that the federal government is actually moving billions and billions of dollars into education, that they're responding. There's a worry about the homework gap. There's a worry about students, having had some gaps in, health. There's worry about mental health. And so there are lots of things that are being measured. And with our sponsor today, I'll just be very honest, I think they're doing something very smart, which is saying, hey, we ought to watch the data, look at what's happening. What are the best practices in Connecticut, which you know so well, or Nevada, that's putting in grants to families that are struggling with disabilities, or, in Texas, looking at accelerated instruction for low-performing students. New Hampshire, we're going to have, Governor Sununu on later talking about summer camp grants. They're there to try to learn what's west. But I'd just be interested, you're sort of the Wizard of Oz of education. You see everything going on. Are there best and promising practices out there that you see that you think that those folks in the educational ecosystem could be learning from today to begin addressing some of these issues as the money comes in?
Sure. So if I'm the Wizard of Oz, I'm not behind a green curtain, but I do have a green tie. Happy St. Patrick's Day. One of the things that when I came on board, I'm a practitioner, and I know teachers learn best from teachers, superintendents learn best from superintendents, and state chiefs learn best from state chiefs. So we created a repository with hundreds of submissions in just 1 year of best practices around reopening and recovery. And now as ARP funds are being used, we're using our platforms, our reach to lift up those best practices. You mentioned some. I'll tell you, in Canton, Michigan, high school with 3 campuses, 6,000 students, they changed the schedule to make sure that every student had a block of time every day for mental health supports or social emotional well-being, because they knew the mental health supports mattered and that they wanted to restructure their day differently. Camden, New Jersey, utilizing the CBOs, using a Boys and Girls Club to do after-school program to give students a safe place to be where they can engage and make up for some of that relational equity that was lost during the pandemic. There are so many great examples, and it is our responsibility to lift them up in a systematic way so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, and we're not trying to solve the same problems across the country without learning from one another.
Look, I know this is a hard question and that there's not an easy fix. And I also don't think there's any doubt that the Biden administration has put equity, as one of the key pillars that it wants to, embrace in its public policy initiatives. But, just for the couple of years that I've been doing these things online, looking at the George Floyd murder, preceding, these big racial questions, Black Lives Matter, then we have a pandemic, we have economic inequality. And what we see through all this is just an unrelenting pattern where those that seem to come out on the top at the end mostly are those who were wired in a certain way. And there are a lot of neglected communities as well that don't have those things come around. Is this an opportunity to really change those stars? And if so, what do we all need to hear? So it can't just be the federal government. What have to be the pieces that move so that we don't have to keep saying that, there's a communities in this country, Black and brown communities, hit disproportionately by disease, by educational malfunction, whatever, that we can begin changing this?
Yeah. No, and I appreciate the way you presented the question. The reality is, I tell leaders all the time, the work is not going to get easier, it's going to get different. Let's not go back to March 2020, that wasn't good enough. And use the urgency, use the passion that you got into this profession with to now talk about the inequities that exist and that were made worse. Use the data. We know the health data over the last 2 years has disparate outcomes for different folks. Use those data, use the American Rescue Plan funds where it's needed, but continue to elevate the importance of equity. And I'm going to tell you, this, equity is under attack. We have as an education leader, we have more challenges now than we did 3 years ago. We have states passing laws that prohibit certain books that talk about our history. We have people trying to remove that from our children's experience, almost rewriting history. We have a challenge ahead of us, but you know what? Educators have proven themselves to be student-centered over these last 2 years, and we have a responsibility to make sure schools unite folks, and bring families together, but also are honest about the challenges that we have. And the gaps were made worse, and we can't go into this. We can't go into this passively. We have to be assertive in ensuring that we're providing students with a great experience, one that can help those students that suffered the most, but also an experience where children see themselves in the materials, where they feel proud of the learning. We can't expect a diverse teacher workforce if we're not acknowledging the experiences of different members of our community. We have to be proactive in fighting back against poor legislation aimed at dividing our country and dividing our schools.
Mr. Secretary, we never have enough time. I love talking to you. Can you come in and do a whole show with me sometime on these issues? But I want to ask you.
I'd love to.
Just in closing, it's just fun. And when I helped launch, years ago, a publication called Quartz. We organized Quartz. It's a financial publication, but in it, we frame things around obsessions. And so I'm interested in obsessions of great public policy leaders and what their obsessions are. We're going to have Senator Bill Cassidy on in a minute. He has fascinating obsessions, which I look at as a good term. What's your North Star in educational obsessions?
I love children. They have so much promise. And that's been my obsession, helping children do well. And I'm blessed to be in this role. That is my North Star, helping children have opportunities to be successful and be happy. And education is that ticket. It was that ticket for me, and that will always be the driving force, my obsession as Secretary.
Well, Dr. Miguel Cardona, Secretary of Education, I really appreciate all the time we get together. Thank you so much for helping to launch today's discussions.
Thank you.
My next guest, as I just mentioned, is a good friend, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Senator Cassidy is a member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Senator, it's great to see you again. Usually, we're talking healthcare. Today, we're going to talk education. I could talk, oil and energy policy right now in this time of great crisis in the country. But what I like very much about some of what you've been trying to put on the table is to remember that not every human being, not every American citizen comes packed with this, wired the same way. Some have challenges and they can become strengths, but you've been focused during this period on those with dyslexia because it is important. We have many famous dyslexics in America who've done just fine, have come along, but you've been worried during this period of time about dyslexia and education. Tell us what you're doing to address that.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me. 1 out of 5 Americans are dyslexic. Now, our country does an incredibly poor job, specifically in the public school system, in both identifying and addressing the dyslexia. When the Secretary of Education speaks about how there is almost a conspiracy against some children, I would agree. But I would say that if 1 out of 5 children are dyslexic, and you're not even screening for it in most places, and the intervention that you have after that has been proven to be ineffective, and yet nonetheless you stay with it, that is a bigger culprit than the fact that somebody's trying to pass a law that'll go into effect 5 years from now after court challenges. It is more important, as a doctor, I would say this, to make the correct diagnosis. Why are 1 out of 4 of our children not reading to grade level? And if you're speaking of children of color, 50% of children of color are not reading at grade level in the 3rd grade. You learn to read first 3 grades, you read to learn thereafter. If they're not reading, if they're reading below the average, below competency in grade 3, their trajectory is diminished. The injustice is that we are not screening and not putting in appropriate implementation of the measures to address it. And instead, we stay with that which is not scientific. You just pushed an obsession of mine, Steve. I'm sorry.
No, I'm really interested because I have a family member. I'm going to be honest, folks. Sometimes it's very personal for me. I had a family member, a brother who was dyslexic, where the treatment he got, like I'm older than the generation in schools now, of course, but he was made to feel it was his fault. It was made to feel as if he was the one there. I mean, you kind of go through that and you see how it damaged a person's sense of self-identity, self-worth, confidence, so many different issues. And then I see famous dyslexics who tell me about that magical moment. People who've been cabinet secretaries in other governments who've said, I had a teacher who finally understood and turned it around and created different opportunities. And we shouldn't be building an education system around miraculous boutique moments. So I guess my question is, that's my little editorial, but my question is the science there? Is the screening there? What would be the story we can scale?
Yes, absolutely. There's a doctor and Dr. Shaywitz at Yale School of Medicine Pediatric Department, who are the only husband-wife team in the National Academy of Science. And they have literally written the book on dyslexia. There is a curriculum which you can employ. Full disclosure, my wife is the chair of the board of a public charter school for children with dyslexia. Now, those people you reference, almost all, if not every single one, had highly educated parents that were able to bring their child to an educational setting in which they were recognized as dyslexic and they were accommodated. What is different is those who are lower income, perhaps single parent family. The parent does not have the resources, perhaps does not even recognize. And she hears her child called stupid. She knows she or he is not stupid, but nonetheless does not have the resources. I would argue that we have to democratize access to that sort of intervention that makes a difference in the life of such a child. That's discriminatory. Again, not some law that's going to be fought in court, implemented 5 years from now. It is the absence of screening and appropriate intervention for those who have less means, including middle-class families who cannot afford the tuition at a high-priced school.
Well, let me ask you the same question I asked Secretary Cardona as well. So, literally billions upon billions of dollars are going out to begin trying to address some of the homework gap, the schooling gaps that we've had out there, the mental health stress, a lot of folks. And you and I have discussed your health approach as a practicing doctor across areas, trying to reach communities that were not well resourced, communities in need. What can we do to do a better job of, in this moment where a lot of money is going out there, to begin trying to rectify some of the imbalances we've had in the past, so that we might help a community leapfrog into a place where at least their opportunities are greater and on par with those who have resources? Steve,
you may recall my principle, if you will, in healthcare is that the patient should have the power. As long as it's an institution, the interest of the institution is for the institution. It has to be the patient. I extend the same thing to education. The parent should have the power. It's usually the mom, so I'll use the feminine. She is the one who has to make the decision. If a school system like Chicago decides that the teachers union decides to shut down, despite receiving hundreds of millions of dollars to stay open and the science showing that they can, but they choose to shut down, that parent should not be tethered, tied, chained to that set of schools. Right. She should have the ability to take the money the school is receiving on her behalf and go to the school which she chooses to bring her child. This is not about an institution of people trying to take care of their pensions. It is about the child. And when we make the focus the child, good things happen.
Let me just ask you quickly, before we have an audience question for you as well. You and Elizabeth Warren are on the same page on something which doesn't happen every day, and it's on college transparency. And one of the things I've been trying to think is, when do we begin thinking about disrupting higher education? A lot of folks are investing a lot of dollars, and they get on the other side, and the opportunities they have may not match up with how they've invested, and they end up with lots of debt. So I'm just really, can you give me a snapshot of how you and Elizabeth Warren are seeing the world the same?
Yeah, it's the same principle. It's the individual should have the power. Right now, a child gets some glossy asking her to borrow a lot of money, take her Pell Grants, and go to a high-priced school to study a curriculum in which she may not graduate. And if she does, the curriculum in which she graduates has little economic opportunity. What we propose is that there be an online, easily accessible and understood database where I'm 18 with my family. I log on, and whatever I look like, if I'm a black female, black male, Hispanic male, white guy, I'm able to log on and say, if I go to this school in this curriculum, what is my likelihood of graduating in 4 years? How much will I expect to borrow? And what will I earn in the future? The best schools track this information, and they have found that sometimes for $100 to $500, a child doesn't graduate, left with the debt, without the degree, without the economic prospects. And they give them $500 and the life is different. On the other hand, if you go through some CRIP course curriculum and you graduate with no skill but to be a barista, then you've just wasted potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. This works for the institution. They get to take care of their facility fees, etc. We need it to work for the student. Elizabeth and I are collaborating to give the student the power of information so that she or he can make the informed decision for their choice.
Fascinating. We have a question for you from Kate. Kate?
Kate Claybaugh, Director of Government Affairs for the National PTA. A question for Senator Cassidy. Any insight into what's coming together in Congress as it relates to youth mental health? And how can advocacy organizations support these efforts on the Hill?
Yeah, so there's a couple aspects to that. I have a real interest in mental health. Clearly, the epidemic with children isolated at home has exacerbated both opioid addictions as well as underlying mental health issues, anxiety disorders, etc. I am personally a big believer in school-based clinics, having done some of my previous work kind of through school-based clinics. There'll be a push to try and allow that care to occur where the child attends school. There'll also be an attempt to make sure that Medicaid screening programs, I think it's EPSDT, will include mental health screening, and that the kind of Medicaid system is not atomized with a bunch of different silos, but rather integrated for the benefit of the child. There also, since unfortunately there's also youth addiction, there'll be more dollars being put towards addictive services. Lastly, I will say, in 2016, Chris Murphy and I got a bill passed, the Mental Health Reform Act of 2016, in which we put out more money for the so-called RAISE program. Typically, people have their major mental illness first episode, late teens, early 20s. And there's a wraparound set of services you can give so that the first episode is the last episode. That has not been implemented as widely as I think it should be. I'll personally be pushing to see a broader implementation, availability of that program.
Senator, one last quick question. I'm going to frustrate my producers, but I think we're going to enter an era where many, many schools that are built in the future and freeways and buildings are going to be named after Vladimir Zelensky. When you heard President Zelensky speak to a joint session of Congress live in a virtual way and share this, you see what's going on where people are really literally fighting for democracy. We throw that word around loosely over here, but there it's very real. I'm just interested in how you personally feel about this moment. Are we doing what we should be doing? Are there elements here where we don't see missiles, taking down theaters with innocent people down the street, but we're seeing it live on TV? And I'm just interested. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this moment.
Yeah, we certainly have a balance. On the one hand, we have to support President Zelensky as much as possible, and on the other, we have to avoid a potential World War III. And I think there are ways to support the Ukrainian people. Obviously, we're doing it with the weaponry we're giving. I have no doubt we're passing intelligence along to them. As regards controlling the skies, which is where the bombs come to blow up the theater, the transfer of SAM 300s, Soviet-era anti-aircraft systems, which the Ukrainians are used to using, the drones that they've used to great effect. And personally, it wouldn't bother me if a group of Ukrainian tourists happened to step into a MiG in Poland and fly them to Ukraine and never come back. Folks say, is that an escalation? I point out that in the Vietnamese War, in the Vietnam War, the Russians gave the North Vietnamese lots of MiGs, and that was not considered an escalation. So if those Ukrainian tourists happen to fly them to Ukraine and keep them there, I think that's within the rules of the game.
Fascinating comment. Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana. I always love our discussions. Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you, Steve.
And now a short message from our sponsor, the Collaborative for Student Success.
The pandemic has put this nation's education system under more pressure than at any other time in modern history.
Across the country, the coronavirus abruptly forced at least 55 million kids from elementary school to college out of their classrooms.
Inequities and flaws that existed before COVID-19 have only deepened. Combine this with the whiplash of reopening policies and polarizing political fights,
And it's easy to understand the fatigue and frustration felt by so many.
Our country has responded to the pandemic with unprecedented federal resources to the tune of $189 billion. States and school districts have been given the power to decide how these funds are used. Leaders are under immense pressure to sensibly, but quickly, apply solutions to problems that affect our students and are crippling our education systems. They can't wait. Action is required in the here and now. They need real-time insight into what can make a difference in student and school recovery. So they need to know the most promising ways to put those recovery dollars to use straight away. And they need to consider how to sustain these efforts when that influx of funding goes away.
Despite the adversity, there are bright spots where schools are innovating. It is possible for our nation's schools to emerge from 2 years of turmoil positioned for success.
we have the potential to make generational advancements in delivering high-quality instruction, supporting students and families, and equipping and empowering parents and educators.
The Collaborative for Student Success is proud to partner with the Center on Reinventing Public Education and the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University on a tool that showcases innovative, high-potential actions that states, districts, and schools are taking right now that deserve to be replicated. Our platform, the Edu Recovery Hub, identifies strong practices in recovery across a variety of school community needs, including approaches for accelerating student learning, supporting educators and families, and improving facilities and technology. We believe that by focusing our attention on these successful practices, we have the opportunity to help schools recover stronger and in a way that benefits all students.
We've already seen promising and bold examples of using these relief funds to meet adversity with ingenuity. Texas is making a firm statement in support of using data to target instruction and drive student learning. In Arizona, state and district officials are coordinating on large-scale expansion of early childhood education programs and modernizing K-12 transportation systems. Connecticut is using the funding to re-engage students who became disconnected during the pandemic by providing in-home family support for children returning to school. Practices like these and many others highlighted on the Edu Recovery Hub show concerted effort on behalf of states and districts to support schools and families, not only in weathering the unpredictable nature of the pandemic, but also redesigning the ways that they can succeed at the essential tasks of educating, protecting, and empowering children and their communities.
If there's any hope this massive infusion of funds will spark innovation, it must also directly involve schools and give power to those at the building level. We've seen what can happen when you give funding directly to schools, so they can decide how best to spend on behalf of their students. A few districts like Boston and Chicago and Denver have already embraced this option and are giving principals the flexibility to respond to the needs of their schools and to pilot new solutions.
We know we haven't captured every good example, which is why we're asking for help in identifying more. We also know that not all of these practices are going to work, which is why we're going to do our best to follow how they're implemented and how they're measured. The pandemic dealt a serious blow to our educational system. At the end of the day, we want our students to get back to learning so that they are best positioned for success. That's going to take sharing and building off of the most promising ideas and using the recovery dollars in the most effective ways possible.
My next two guests are experts on how we can make education much more inclusive. Lindsay Jones is the CEO of the education nonprofit CAST, which is working to improve inclusivity in the practice and design of education. She's also the former president and CEO of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And Ray Saldana is the president and CEO of Communities in Schools, a national organization with a mission of keeping kids in school and on the path to a brighter future. Welcome to you both. Ray, I was just enjoying your Twitter feed and saw this cool thing from February with you with a selfie with Secretary Cardona. So, you know, there you go. We almost got you on the screen together again. But I'm interested to just start out about these questions. So I think part of the challenge we have today is thinking about this awful period the nation has gone through. And in that awful period, a lot of resources are coming in. So how do we basically take the wobbly parts of the system that weren't performing right and improve them? And so with all due respect, I hear communities and schools, I know you're president, and you're actually a product, you're an alum of that. There are elements that I find in my job. I run into these fascinating boutiques, these stories, these positive stories. And then when you kind of look for scale or data or what can we replicate, sometimes fall short. So tell us about communities and schools, and if you can make the case that what you've done there is something that might enhance or build or change educational opportunity elsewhere in the country.
Well, that's a really great question, and I will use a question that you asked of Secretary of Education, our Secretary of Ed, which is, what are we supposed to be obsessive about? I'll tell you what we are obsessive about here at Communities and Schools. It's how do we center building relationships? Because what we really, really care about is how do you get a student turned on to living? Because living is the hard part. Before you can get turned on to learning, the living piece needs to be set with the student and with the family. And I'll push a little bit and say that at one point we were probably boutique 20 years ago. At this point now we're in 3,000 schools. But we also see the vision of evidence-based wraparound student services, not just being what Communities and Schools can do to grow into every Title I school, which we're focused on. And these are students that are serving a majority of students who are living in poverty. It's that we actually get to see a definition that more schools, whether those are superintendents and policymakers, are obsessed about the same thing we are. Because if you're obsessed about learning loss, you have to ensure that a student is well fed, that they have access to quality, stable housing, that they have access to mental health supports. And so what we do is essentially, as a national nonprofit, work alongside our principals and our teachers, because let's do something that I would advise against with so much crisis happening in the world. Let's put ourselves in the mind of a superintendent. Currently, what they're solving for is not only learning loss, it's teacher shortage, it's bus shortages. It is a crisis at their door and just getting schools reopened. So the earthquake happened. The aftershock is what we need to be focused on in terms of redesigning a future with the elements of perhaps a budgeted a person who is actually on the school, coordinating the resources inside of the school. That's what we've been doing at Communities and Schools for 45 years. But really, I think that's the vision that many superintendents are saying, can I figure this out on our own? Are there outside agencies that can help do this? Because that really is the future of the movement and the building of the field of wraparound student services. So we're excited. We're in about half the country now, but we believe that this needs to be a component of public education if we're to envision one with equity and justice for those students who we're serving.
I will not be able to think about a superintendent in the way I did a few moments ago. So it's a fascinating depiction you did. I felt stress up and down my neck a moment ago. But Lindsay Jones, I'll ask you an equally tough question. I mean, you're interested in education, transforming education design. You also have a tilt, I see it in your Twitter feed, on how do we help children with learning disabilities, those people, and not just children, it's across the board. How do we make sure that we have an inclusive picture and not one where people are just adjunct to what's going on, if you will. And I guess the question I have is, what are the barriers, as you see it? And I'd love to hear your story, but what are the things that get in the way of actually coming out with something that just, where gravity works towards inclusion, where it becomes more natural and not so hard? I don't know if that's the right way to frame it, but that's what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a critical question for the future, and something that was so highlighted by the pandemic itself and what happened to education and all of us, all of our work world throughout it. The future has to be more flexible. There is not one type of learner. The world and what we know about learning science shows us that it's rich and complicated, and our education system has to be designed to maximize that. And so to do that, it has to be designed for variability. One way to do that is to look at people who currently now we would consider to be on the margins. So we'd be designing for them. What we've learned over time through almost everything is that when we design with accessibility in mind, with inclusion in mind, we end up helping everyone so much more. We make a system that's much more flexible for all of us. So many people will talk about the factory model of education. And I think, as Ray has described it in such rich terms, the way we're looking to design in the future is one that helps educators help bring out the strengths and the talents of all students. And critically, I think it's mindsets. It's maybe unlearning a little bit about the way that we were taught toward this factory model. It's changing the mindset of what we are trying to measure and of what strengths individuals bring. I think a critical piece of information that we learned during the pandemic was that outside of education, many people using video conferencing were on Zoom, were live streaming, Teams as an example. More people across the globe used captioning during the pandemic than ever before. Most of those people didn't have a disability that required that, and yet found that really useful. So at CAST, what we're trying to do is work with educators in schools and work with adult learners in apprenticeship programs and other types of job training, youth build programs to make sure that we're designing flexibly and that educators, when they see barriers, are ready to respond to pull those barriers down.
Let me just ask you both really quickly, because we're already out of time again, but you know, the collaborative that's supporting today's conversation, I really mentioned the sponsor, but they deserve mentioning. They have a website called Edu Recovery Hub. So I went on. It's really, about, hey, let's learn what we can about this money, best practices, and let's look at data. And it's too early to tell, but a couple of things they had popping out, when you're watching, at least on my iPhone, was in Texas, where I think you are, Ray. They're giving 30 hours of accelerated instruction to low-performing students. In Nevada, they're giving, Lindsay, $5,000 grants for families that are suffering, who have childhood disabilities. I'm just interested in whether both of you, whether those resonate, but secondly, very quickly, do you see things we ought to be showing and telling? I love show and tell. Are there things and practices that we could learn from each of you that we ought to be putting in this program? We can't go in depth now, but what would be some of those items, right?
Yeah, well, as you did, I also got on the Edu Recovery Hub, and it is just a really great resource to identify, with $180 billion out the door from federal support, with the kind of flexibility that we are seeing school leaders and principals and superintendents really go after this. They're putting some contours, which I think are really helpful. And I'm glad I'm on with Lindsay, because if anybody is testing the molds of an old system, it's the folks at CAST. But I also think our superintendents and our leaders are doing that at the same time, because they're thinking about what Senator Cassidy talked about. How do you implement mental health supports? How do you implement social emotional learning? But at the same time, how do you track for improvement with your students? And so we think there is, this is a war at play, speaking of crisis, but there is an army that you need to fight this inside our schools. And of course, as an organization, we've got about 4,000 staff alongside our principals. Let's not do this. Let's not make the mistake of layering more pressures on top of the existing staff that are already inside schools. But what I think is one particularly important feature of the pandemic, and I was just talking to students from Eastern Area High School, that is us getting into more living rooms and stairwells than we ever have in the past. And that's important for family engagement.
Thank you. Lindsay, last word.
I just agree that there are so many great resources on the Edu Recovery Hub, and we need those great ideas, because we are creating this system as we're living it. And I think, here at CAST, of course, we're focused on universal design for learning, which incorporates lots of those practices, but allows for our educators to be supported in shifting to a mindset that is flexible. And I couldn't agree more with what Ray said about we need everybody in every school on the ground thinking about and working on these problems.
Really a pleasure to talk to you both. It's inspiring to talk to people out working in education. I don't get to do it that much, and so I get very excited in these conversations. I really want to thank Lindsay Jones, CEO of CAST, and Ray Saldana, President and CEO of Communities and Schools. Really, thank you so much for all you were doing and for talking with us today.
Thank you.
My next guests are on the front lines of education recovery efforts. Charlene Russell Tucker is the commissioner of the Connecticut State Department of Education. Commissioners have it tough too, but we already heard about superintendents. Dr. Lisa Herring is the superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools. It's really great to be both with Lisa. Let me start with you, because we just talked, hey, superintendents, they're not just, they're having to deal with school buses, school nurses, lunch programs. That's before you get to teachers and the students themselves. So let me just ask you how awful your day is today.
So I appreciate your question and just the acknowledgement of the complex but critical role of the superintendent. So I'm going to choose not to use the word awful, but I will tell you it's awfully busy. It is full of multitasking, from school visits to committee meetings to opportunities like this to advocate and to always keep front of mind that our core business is teaching and learning, and our end client falls between the ages of 4 to 21. So that's the work, right? It's been quite a day. Thank you for asking.
And before I jump to Charlene, I want to ask you, federal dollars are coming in. I'm sure you're going to have a way to help distribute those. What are your priorities? What's driving the decisions as you sort of look at how to best apply those dollars, both to help students and teachers after the time they've come through, to deal with I'm sure teacher retention and teacher attraction to be teachers? What are the elements there that matter most on your dashboard?
So I'm appreciative even of the earlier part of the conversation. So let me just speak directly to what we've identified as some of our most critical bodies of work. First and foremost, it's the traumatization and the wellness and well-being of our students and our staff. As we started out this school year and took inventory of the last year and a half or 2 or even 3 years, we honed in on how our students had been performing, how they've been impacted, and how federal dollars could help us here in the Atlanta public school system focus in on accounting for student proficiency and success. But there's a twofold dynamic. So we've invested in things such as a universal screener, both for academic proficiency, but we also invested in a universal screener to help us access and assess student well-being. We utilize what's called a universal BAS screener, so we can do a wellness assessment for students, and we share the data results with parents. The academic universal screener gave us an opportunity to start building baseline data on how our scholars are performing both in reading and mathematics, and in both cases, K-12. But it certainly doesn't stop there. I said that wellness is critical. We've invested in additional school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers. We knew at the onset, as we pivoted back into a new normal from the pandemic, that was going to be critical. And of course, we've invested in mental health supports for our teachers as well as how we could become that much more creative with adjusting for recruiting and retaining high quality professionals in all areas of how a school system works. The classroom, the school bus driver, which is just nationally a challenge as well, and other resources that we believe will help us continue to sustain our children's success.
Well, thank you. Well, Commissioner Russell Tucker, I've been trying to get at something. And if you look up Connecticut and education, and you even kind of look at the folks that are supporting today's conversations, they're saying Connecticut is leaning in on the front end on data, measuring what works, the orientation somehow. The water you drink in Connecticut is somehow different than everywhere else. So what's the deal? What are you getting? What do you feel you're getting right? And then more importantly, what are the challenges you think have there where things aren't necessarily going? I worry about, rah-rah talk. So tell us what you're not happy with.
So I'll start with what are those things you're happy with, because that's really important, right? And you're correct about the things that we're focused on. And so with the influx of federal resources, we thought it was really important at the State Department of Education leadership level to really set forth some priorities for investments. And I hear some of them Dr. Herring just spoke to. Learning acceleration, we know that was critical in student enrichment. But we also wanted to make sure we're tapping into family and community connections. So that's an investment priority. Of course, social emotional and mental health support for student and staff. Really important that we're not just focused on students. Talk about strategic use of technology in new and innovative ways, and making sure our buildings are safe and healthy for student and staff. And so we set those priorities forward, Steve, as these are the investments that we want to be making, not just at the local level, but also at the State Department of Education level. And then it was a matter of saying, okay, but we have these resources. How are we accountable for those resources, and how do we know what works to make sure our investments are hitting the mark? So when you talk about the Edu Recovery Hub, you notice, and you've probably seen it there, Connecticut being one to watch when it comes to data. We decided, how do we make sure we know what works? And that's where we really lean in on this groundbreaking collaborative, having our public colleges and universities to say, let's get a collaborative together that's going to evaluate almost in real time so we know how to move forward. For example, we invested about $8 million for student enrichment last summer. Before we make another investment this summer, let's pause, let's see what worked, what didn't work, so that we can better target the funding for this upcoming summer. So those are the things that we're working on. We think those are the right moves, but there's still challenges, as you mentioned, and we have to recognize those, the trauma that staff or families or communities face. And also recognize this is not, we've got to think about outside the schoolhouse doors, right? And whole communities. Our kids are in families that live in communities. And so what are communities, what are their role in what it is that we needed to do?
Right.
So the challenges are there that we have to work through together, what I call best-in-class collaboration with all our partners.
Well, Commissioner, I don't mean to be facetious here, but you've got, I was looking up this thing, and you've got this Connecticut Voice for Change initiative that empowers high school students to decide. You've got a $1.5 million relief fund budget that you're given control of the high school. I just want to say, are you crazy? Like, is this, maybe this is taking inclusive decision making too far. So turn an old fuddy-duddy like me into a believer. Is that a good thing? Have you measured the data? How did it go?
It's an awesome thing, Steve, and hopefully I make a believer out of you. Okay. It is not about them without them. Our high school students are future leaders. And so how about investing in them, about civic engagement? The process isn't finished yet, but we use the same priorities that I shared with you. And we say to high school students, with some guardrails, tell us how you would like to invest each $20,000 in your school, right, in addressing education recovery. And so they went to work, and they all submitted grant proposals to us. Totally, there's accountability. So we reviewed them, and out of the 200 plus proposals that came to us, and we did a lot of webinars to encourage them to do this, and press conferences with them. And so we encouraged them to do it. And now, of those that are eligible for funding, they go back to their schools and they campaign, right? They're campaigning in their schools for a winning proposal that will come forward for funding. So we're still in the process, yes. Our collaborative will be evaluating those as well, but it is awesome. Would you know, most of the proposals, the majority of proposals about social emotional well-being, right? It shows us that even for students' own well-being, they recognize how important this is for them. So we're excited about giving students a voice for change and encouraging civic engagement at the same time. Right. Well, Dr. Herring, thank you for that. Dr. Herring, I've got a question for both of you, which we'll get to in just a second, but I want to ask you very quickly. It's unfair to ask you this quickly. I'm surprised at how political your jobs have become. And I guess the kind of question I have is, as you sort of survey the stakeholders in Atlanta education, what's it look like between the level of frustration and anger out there, whether it's about what teachers are doing, what books they're using, how they're teaching things, the frustration over masks, to those that are, as Dr. Russell Tucker, Commissioner Russell Tucker just talked about, of folks that are getting built-in decision-making in constructive ways. What's the ratio between negativity and positivity that you're dealing with in terms of, I maybe that's an unfair way to put it, but when I think about book banning, some of the issues that are coming up that I see, issues in the wake of George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter, I know superintendents in counties that have been fired because they were trying to do the right thing in bringing these elements forward. So I guess my question to you is, give us a quick snapshot, if you don't mind, of what we need to do to make that a healthy ecosystem that people, and to decrease the frustration and anger.
What a critical question, and one in which I'm not going to try to answer with a rushed response, because there are several thoughts to that question, Steve. Let me just start with the first. What has the political climate been like? This is for me as a superintendent in general. This goes into now what will be, as this year closed out, a 5th year as a superintendent, and of course being here in Atlanta during the pandemic, as we've all navigated through it. The political climate intensified significantly for all of the reasons that you've named. But what I stay committed to as a superintendent is what I said earlier, and that's tied to our core business in our work, which is teaching and learning. But here's what I believe has been a part of the experience as a superintendent: this unique juxtaposition of politics versus trust in what we do on a day-to-day for our children. And in that space of balancing a more politically energized or charged community or culture or city or state with the day-to-day commitment to not only ensure that our children are well, but have faith and confidence in what we do relative to student learning, has put school systems, school superintendents, teachers, principals alike in a space where we have the capacity to help neutralize, but we have to regain and rebuild the trust that we've historically had with parents as it relates to educating our children. Whether that conversation has been about how do we create an environment that is comfortable and that is non-judging and that is safe for teachers and students to discuss issues of peace and war, or to have conversations relative to issues tied to what our students have read or have curiosities about, both from a political standpoint, but also from the standpoint of teaching and learning. School systems have a power to help neutralize that as long as we can maintain an ability to ensure trust. What we've done in Atlanta Public Schools, particularly with my administration since I've been in place, is to start what we've called our Center for Equity and Social Justice. In that Center for Equity and Social Justice, we do have our district's first Chief Equity and Social Justice Officer. But that department and that division touches on all aspects of how school systems operate and how do we interface with stakeholders. So we've been very transparent and candid, whether that's with our political legislative delegation. And I'm happy that we have healthy relationships there, but we have to work at those relationships, in addition to the fact that we work with a parent and teacher community as well as students around voice and how do we engage into courageous conversations without it turning into a debate or a battle. And again, I say classrooms and schoolhouses have been for many years a place where we can neutralize and engage, and being able to continue to do that is perhaps more critical than ever. But given that conflict, yes, it has been more political. What are we doing? Well, we're focusing in on those relationships, but we're not forgetting what our core work is and who we serve at the very end, and those are our children.
You both are terrific, and I'm going to hold my question until later in the program because we've run out of time. These were both powerful conversations. Really, really grateful. Charlene Russell Tucker, Commissioner of the Connecticut State Department of Education. Loved your insights. Lisa Herring, Dr. Lisa Herring, Superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure to be with you as well. Thank you.
My next guest is Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, a great friend of the Hill. He previously served, of course, as representative for Colorado in Congress, spent 6 years on the State Board of Education. He is a great entrepreneur as well. Just this week, Governor Polis unveiled his state's own universal pre-K plan. Governor Polis, always great to see you, my friend. When I saw what you've committed to in universal pre-K, and paying for that, as we are debating in the United States, paying at the federal level for universal pre-K, Colorado stepped forward and said, we're not going to wait, we're going to do it on our own. Do you get reimbursed later if we do pass it on the federal level, or you're able to move those funds out there? But I mean, it's a powerful step forward, and I'm just wondering what drove you forward on that rather than waiting for what was embedded in Build Back Better?
Well, thank you, Steve. It's good to see you again. Hope all is well. And brief answer your question, by the way, when the federal government does deliver more support for preschool, it'll add hours to the high quality program that we're funding here in Colorado. So a big reason I ran for governor in Colorado is we are a laggard. We were a laggard in early childhood education. We only had half-day kindergarten for free. Parents had to pay $500 a month for full-day kindergarten, and very little preschool. We have a few slots for low income. But if you were, working middle class, you couldn't afford it, didn't get it free, no preschool for you. And we know the importance of early childhood education to prevent learning gaps from occurring before they occur, to prepare kids for success, also for the benefit of the workforce and the economy today, which is really under a magnifying glass with the labor shortages across the country. So we got full day kindergarten funded in my first year in office, and then we took preschool to the voters. And more than 2/3 of the voters of Colorado, Steve, just to show you what a basic value that we agree on, red counties, blue counties, rural, urban, 67.8% of Coloradans said yes, kids ought to be able to go to preschool. It's funded. It'll start out about 10 to 12 hours a week, high quality preschool. The data shows that's the most important, that basis. So, it's a 3-day program, 4 hours a day, that type of program. Of course, parents can pay for more, but we would love to be able to get support from the federal government to run a 20-hour a week or 22-hour a week program. We'll already have that with some additional funding sources for some of the most at-risk kids, and of course, parents who can pay for it. But at the very least, families across Colorado will get 10, 12 hours a week of free, high quality preschool to prepare their kid for success.
Governor, I think today is going to be a really good show that will have some shelf life. And what I want to have in this, as we talk to our viewers today, but the ones that come back and say, hey, what can I learn from this, is sort of a show and tell of what states and local governments are doing with the dollars they're getting in different ways. Some of the things I've been reading about, in Colorado, you've taken apparently $9 million in federal aid and put it in mental health initiatives. Some folks are putting, small mini grants to families to help their kids have summer camp experiences. Others are adding optional, San Antonio independent school district doing 30 days of optional school to deal with learning loss. So there are lots of different things out there that are evolving. And I'm wondering, and maybe this is putting you on the spot in the wrong way, but are there other innovations? You're sort of Mr. Innovation, when you're in the private business world, but as a policy maverick, are there other innovations that you're looking at and trying out to see if they work to deal with learning loss, to deal with education reform, equity, and this kind of 2 awful years that have just sucked for so many people as we look at education?
Yeah, Steve, we always look for the silver lining, or when you're given, lemons, you make lemonade. And so I'm going to tell you about a couple things. One is I was particularly thrilled that part of the CARES Act had a GEAR program, money that went right to governor's offices to invest in the highest needs areas for education. So what we did in Colorado is we asked for innovation. We said, what good ideas do our districts have, do our community colleges, our charter schools have that they've never been able to fund? It was pie in the sky. What could you do if you had, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million? Show us the runway for 3 years. And obviously, if it works, you'll find additional funding sources going forward. And we got amazing ideas. I mean, we got partnerships between community colleges and school districts where their kids are getting skills and associate's degrees while they're in high school. We got a partnership with immigrant and refugee centers for English language learners. We got extended days. We got mobile learning stations in Lake County in the mountains. So a lot of great proposals that we were able to fund because of the federal funding. Now, the larger amount of federal funding under the ARPA Act, we are now working with the legislature. It's not just up to governors to spend, but we've identified the areas and we're honing in. One of those areas that you alluded to is behavioral health. So we already provide 3 mental health counseling sessions free for any high schooler in Colorado. It's the iMatters program. We're rolling out additional behavioral health support in our schools. We're also upgrading facilities around the ability for step downs for people of all ages that were on mental health holds. And where do you go when you're no longer on a 24 or 72-hour hold? It's not healthy for you or for the rest of us to just send you out on the street. We got to have a good step down facility, as well as support for youth intervention programs. And that's part of our public safety package. All of this is enabled because of the strong situation our state budgeted in, and like many other states, that's partially because of the investment from the American Rescue Act funds that we're able to have these discussions.
Look, you and I have a ton of friends who are lawyers, and at some point there became this concern that we had too many lawyers in the country and not enough scientists. And last time I was in Denver, I was really blown away by the state level of investment in science and technology centers throughout the state, but also commitment on education. Science was a big deal, and I think it is in California. I think probably in other states that I had less, tangible familiarity with. But I am interested in, as we kind of think about what we're trying to sculpt and create, are there areas of focus, like trying to bring more people of color and get greater gender balance, et cetera, in science, et cetera, that are priorities for you, or am I walking down the wrong alley?
Yeah, so we have some great research. Colorado State University, University of Colorado, together over $1 billion in research. We also deeply appreciate, Steve, there's a direct tie-in to our innovation and science ecosystem to the federal government, because we're the home of the National Renewable Energies Laboratory, NIST, NOAA. A lot of that federal presence, which leads directly, of course, to spin-off technologies, but also to this ecosystem of scientific talent, people moving back and forth from the private sector into the federal research sector. And yes, we are also, University of Colorado Boulder is also the home to National Council for Women in Technology, which does amazing work and has had great progress. They're a national organization, but we like to lead with some of their best practices in Colorado, getting closer to achieving equity in technology for women. We also have a number of efforts around better diversity for people of color in all fields. And one of the keys that you find for both women and people of color is it starts early. It's not just a program at a college, middle school, high school. This is when decisions are made about whether people are going into engineering and computer science. And you need to make sure that you show that role model, that mentorship, the academic supports that are needed. So A, people go to college, and B, they go to college on a track where they can get a degree in a field that allows them to earn a good living in science.
Look, when you were in Congress and we would talk, I had no doubt that you were progressively inclined. You were also an incredible pragmatic deal maker. There is this tension right now, particularly in the Democratic Party, between different wings of how we sort things out. Is the Biden administration doing the kinds of things, helping you in the ways as a governor to actually get things done? And do you feel that tension among your Democratic Party colleagues between, strong ideological positions and the fact that sometimes we've got to cut corners or do deals to kind of move the nation forward in other ways?
So the biggest thing that the Biden administration, Congress has done is empowered states to innovate through the American Rescues Act and the CARES Act. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that we're not so grateful for the ability to really push the envelope, not only in education through all the transformative investments with our GEAR grants, but in housing, in behavioral health. We have a very strong public safety package. Our goal is to make Colorado one of the 10 safest states over the next 5 years, including support for retaining and training law enforcement. All of these are possible because of Congress and the administration's work to support innovation at the state level, which is a great idea. That's why we pushed our GEAR Act down to the local level. We said, what great ideas do you have as a high school principal, as an elementary school principal that we can empower you to do? Because often that very best innovation comes from the level of government closest to the people. And we can facilitate that. We can be a catalyst for it. And that's one of the most constructive roles, not only for the federal government, but also for the state.
Jared, I have Governor Chris Sununu coming on next. And, of course, we know that he's decided that being governor is more fun than running for the Senate or being a senator. How do you feel about that choice of yours?
Well, I was honored to serve 10 years in the United States Congress. And in many ways, it prepared me to be a better governor than if I had come directly from the business sector in terms of being able to work with legislators to get an agenda done. But no, being governor is a great job, especially of an incredible state like Colorado, where we're able not just to talk about things, but we deliver on preschool and kindergarten for every kid. We did a bipartisan infrastructure package to prepare our roads and build out EV charging infrastructure without all the hemming and hawing that they eventually got it done, but bogged down Washington on that topic for months. So just the speed at which we can move and innovate is very exciting, especially in a state like Colorado, which is a very forward-looking, innovative state. So we're doing new things every day, and we're going to double down on what works, and we're going to change what doesn't work.
Okay, and super fast, you teased the world, millions of your followers on Twitter, telling them that they could order Girl Scout cookies. If they didn't have Girl Scouts down at the supermarket, they could order, from digital through digital cookie and get their cookies. But you didn't tell them what your favorite cookies from Girl Scouts were. So tell us what your favorite box of Girl Scout cookies is.
I'm a Thin Mints guy.
There you have it, folks. Everybody wanted to know. My team said you have to ask this. Well, Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, thank you for what you're doing on the education front in Colorado. Thanks, as always, for taking my call.
Good to see you. See you again soon, Steve.
So joining us next, as I just said, is Governor Chris Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire. His state has found interesting ways to support student wellness, including covering up to $650 of summer camp fees. Governor Sununu, it's great to be with you. And you heard me just kind of having some fun with your decision about the Senate run and governor. I know a lot of senators that were former governors. In fact, it's like John Hoeven, Joe Manchin, a lot of these folks that have been governors before, and they really lament not being governors and just being in the Senate. So I can tell you, at least from that crowd, maybe you're right. But tell us a little bit about how you're approaching these two awful years, learning loss, mental health pressures, and helping to kind of, I don't know what the word is. It's not just heal, but it's actually bounce back after these years. What are the kinds of investments you're making in your youth in New Hampshire?
Well, first, a big thanks. Thanks for having me on. I think we have to cover something very important first. Thin Mints are the best, but they got to be in the freezer. You got to get them out of the freezer very cold, and then otherwise you got to go with the Samoa. So Jared and I definitely agree on that. We actually agree on a lot. I think Governor Polis is frankly doing a great job out in Colorado. I think a lot of governors are, because we've had such tough years. And as he talked a little bit about, there has been some flexibility with CARES Act money and ARP money to really innovate and try new things, because the impact of COVID has hit kids so hard, especially in schools. Now, here in New Hampshire, we have some phenomenal public schools, some of the highest ranked public schools in the country. Very proud of our schools. I'm the first governor in 25 years to come up through the public schools of New Hampshire. But especially during COVID, you had a lot of individuals and a lot of children just fall through the cracks. Some kids were fine on Zoom, but a lot weren't. And so it's not just an exacerbation of that academic gap, but the mental health gaps and whatnot. So trying to be very innovative, looking to the summer. A lot of places said, well, kids missed a lot of school, so we'll have them make it up during the summer. Terrible idea. I mean, really terrible idea. Because if anybody needs a break, it's those kids. They need to re-socialize. They need to get out. They need to enjoy the outdoors. And so what we do is we invested a lot of our dollars into those types of programs to kind of bridge the gap on the mental health challenges, bridge the gap on the opportunities. The key to education is very simple: opportunity. It really, really is. And trying innovative things and not saying, well, the system needs to go here. It's the individual needs to go here. And so what do I do with my system to wrap my system around the needs of that individual? And that's really the opportunity I think a lot of states are challenging themselves with, seeing what can be done. If you're going to have the same system running like it was 1985, it ain't going to work. It's just not. So, in some ways there was an opportunity with COVID, with the federal money coming in, to really be creative and innovative. And again, it's making sure they have their pathway. My job isn't to tell them what their pathway is. It's just to open up those doors of opportunity. So whether it's school choice, which we got here, especially for lower and middle income kids across the state, whether it's expansion of our charter schools, whether it's expansive tutoring and home programs, our Learn Everywhere program, where you don't have to, even if you go to the public schools, which are phenomenal, you can take classes other places and get credit for it in the school. Your path is what's going to make you successful.
You've got a program up there. I don't know if I'm just reading about it in my notes. It's called the New Hampshire Department of Education 603 Bright Futures Survey. Now, what I think it's a show and tell, and you've got parents and teachers and administrators all coming to share perspectives and experiences from different schools. So it sounds like a state show and tell program of like what's promising. Are you involved with that? Is there something that, that's something Colorado might look at, or Florida or other places? Because, I got to be honest, I do a lot of traveling in this country. I do a lot of speaking about foreign policy, but I would go try to, stick my head into local issues. This is a topic that's full of anguish and concern and anxiety. People want their kids to do better, but when you really kind of remove the veneer off, not only do you have the mental health stress and all of these issues, you have a lot of debate, political debate, about what ought to be out there in terms of how we approach this. And so I like these constructive models. And you're from a crazy state where half the states, thinks one way and half the state thinks the other, which makes it so interesting. So is this a constructive and positive form of show and tell?
Absolutely, because the stakeholders have the answers, right? The answers are not in the four walls of the State House. I don't have all the answers. We are the tools, and it's our job to go out and find those stakeholders, find out where those barriers are, make sure that they have a voice and an input, and not just, well, we're going to have another blue ribbon commission that studies this and they can get a report out next year, blah, blah, blah. That's a bunch of garbage. We want stakeholders to come to the table, give ideas, and then it's our job to move quickly. And with the flexibility that the CARES Act money provided, and a little bit with the ARP money and the what they call GEARS money and the ESA money that's coming in various tranches, there's a ton of money in public education right now. I mean, we put more dollars per child into public education here in New Hampshire this past year, and my guess is that's probably true in most states. But it isn't about throwing more money at it, right? In the old way of doing it, the parents, the stakeholders. Not to get political, but Governor Youngkin really in Virginia really hit it home when he said parents matter. And that isn't just about mass or not mass. That's very short-sighted. It's really back to that concept of the individual. Let's listen. And we don't always know. We think we know where the barriers in a system are, but only the stakeholders can really tell us what worked, what didn't, what were the indirect and maybe unanticipated consequences. And it's okay. Look, we're public officials. If we try 5 new things and 3 of them work, great. It's our job to build some flexibility in this system to say, look, these 2 didn't work. That's okay. We're going to pivot our funds, pivot our thought process and try something new. But that something new has to come from the parents, has to come from the stakeholders. And that's what that program's all about.
Are you a data governor? I remember, when Mike Bloomberg was a data mayor, Eric Garcetti, even Rahm Emanuel, would say they had these little, iPads with all the data coming in. And then I met, Mike Rawlings of Dallas once, and he says, oh, I don't have one of those. I need to become a data mayor. So, I mean, part of our question is, are we learning and taking data in? Like Connecticut very clearly is, but in New Hampshire, are you, because otherwise you end up being captured by boutiques and passion. I'm just wondering, there may be things you stumble across, but you get the feedback, didn't have the impact you have, other things might have. So, are you getting data feeds on some of these experiments you're doing?
Absolutely. I'm an engineer. I was an engineer for 12 years in the civil and environmental world. I love the data, the numbers, the trends. The key with data is a couple things. Number one, sometimes you're like, well, we'll just collect the data, and collecting it can be harder than you anticipate. And sometimes it's going to take 18 months to create the computer system and, to get the data. And we can't ask teachers to spend 2 hours a day just inputting the data of what happened in their classroom. That's understandable. So how are we going to make it simple and figure out here's 100 data points that would be really interesting, but here's the 3 or 4 that are really critical in the decision-making process. And then not just looking at it to say, here's the data, so therefore we'll do this, but using that data for, predictive analytics as well. Data can tell you not just what you've seen, but where you're going. And that way you can head some of this stuff off at the pass before, you get too far down a path. So how you collect it, how you use it, using it in the right way for both learning from the past and predicting the future, all of that really has to come into play. And it isn't just the governor sitting there with his iPad trying to figure it out. You got to have a good team. Everything is about teamwork and having folks that understand your mission, understand your goals, and don't mind giving you the good news and the bad news at the same time. And the last piece, if I may, is understanding, we're a fairly small state, 1.4 million people. We have, our city of Manchester, maybe 110,000, a lot of rural communities. We have communities with 1-room schoolhouses, and we have high schools with 2,000 kids. What is right for the high school in downtown Manchester might be very different than a rural community with a schoolhouse. And so also saying, even from a state standpoint, it isn't one size fits all. We have to allow local flexibility. Something New Hampshire does very, very well, right? We don't have sales tax. We don't have income tax. We're getting rid of our interest and dividends tax, which means the bulk of our taxes, the little bit that we have, are paid at the local level, and the bulk of that goes to schools. The reason there is that way parents can work directly with teachers, and they have a ton of input on how those dollars are being spent on their children. And so listening to those local aspects of what's happening, whether it's out in the western part of New Hampshire or in downtown Nashua, those can be 2 very different discussions, but you have to, again, allow those systems to have flexibility to design their path to meet the needs of their kids and their citizens based on the socioeconomics, based on some of the different barriers that they might have, some of the political challenges they might have. Flexibility is the key to everything.
Well, I tell the audience, I love New Hampshire, and I actually ran away from home once because my father was stationed then at what was known as Pease Air Force Base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I went to Portsmouth High School for a year. And he was going to get stationed to Japan, and I ran away because I said, no, I want to stay here in New Hampshire. So true story, actually. And
well, I hope it all worked out well.
I could have been one of those 1.4 million. I am in spirit.
What the live free or die spirit is all about, and it's hard. Sometimes I tell young people, I lived in Massachusetts for a few years. I lived in San Francisco for a few years. I was traveling when I was doing my engineering across the country, and it's beautiful. I mean, we have this amazing country, but when it comes to the things that really matter about having a say in your family's path, having a say in education, there's no place like it. There's just no place like New Hampshire. And so, sometimes you need those experiences, and sometimes, you just love where you are.
Just real quick, final, is there stuff, presidents, all presidencies are important, and the White House has a lot of power. Are there things you'd like them to do on this education front that they're not?
In some ways, I would say less is more. So in other words, don't throw Washington bureaucracy and Washington barriers in our way because you kind of want the one size fits all type big government mentality. Let Colorado do what Colorado does best, and we'll let New Hampshire do what New Hampshire does best. And in doing that, by the way, I can pick up the phone to the folks in Colorado. I can pick up the phone to Massachusetts or Virginia or Texas or Illinois and say, hey, we hear about this great program. How does that work? And governors can share those ideas. I mean, governors, for the most part, work in a very bipartisan way. We have to live up to certain results and standards and accountability that Washington doesn't. And I think we all take that very seriously. And in that sense, we're all kind of on the same team, and we're all willing to share those ideas. We did it great during COVID, but there's a lot of other areas. Mental health. How are you implementing a Medicaid-based mental health program in your high schools? Is it working? Are students taking advantage? Are other parents coming in to use those types of programs? So that's the key, is that flexibility. Don't states are the laboratories of democracy and the laboratories of innovation. So let us do what we do best and set the models for everybody else. And that is a rising tide floats all boats mentality.
So Governor Chris Sununu, state of New Hampshire, really like that you heard it. Thin mints have to be frozen. If not, go for Samoas. Really appreciate it. I hope we can do this again.
Anytime. Thank you guys so much.
And now a quick message from our sponsor, the Collaborative for Student Success.
Frozen carbon dioxide.
Frozen carbon dioxide, or CO2.
H2O.
America's students must be empowered to shape their futures as they embark into a new world that's been dramatically reshaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. It won't be good enough to know what to think. They will need to know how to think. They must be prepared to analyze and interpret data, to plan and implement investigations, and perhaps most importantly, to make evidence-based decisions and arguments. Essentially, students will need to think like scientists in their everyday lives, regardless of their career choice. States have made great strides setting high standards for rigorous learning, but setting the bar is only the first step. We have a long way to go to support schools, particularly schools with underserved populations of students. By aligning high-quality science instructional materials, tools, and resources, we can turn this vision into reality.
Even before the pandemic, student achievement in science was stagnant. Nearly a fifth of today's teachers are using outdated and ineffective science materials. Half of teachers say that they are creating classroom materials themselves, spending upwards of 12 hours a week piecing together curriculum from unproven sources. Science teachers routinely receive the least amount of professional development and curriculum-aligned learning opportunities across core subjects.
Schools need support now to accelerate learning and help students gain the skills, knowledge, and habits of thinking to succeed today and in the future.
But there is definitely opportunity. Our nation's $190 billion response to K-12 education disruption could translate to a host of permanent improvements to the ways we equip teachers and their students. These include potentially transformational impacts on how we support and implement high-quality science education. By focusing attention and investments wisely, states and districts are positioned to advance better and more equitable science education. We can do this by improving availability of and access to high-quality instructional materials designed to help students learn to think and apply their knowledge to solve problems. Developing and supporting a diverse science teaching workforce should also be a priority. And we must design pathways for students that are consistently evaluated and strengthened with evidence and with support.
Our students face a challenging future. High-quality science education will help them meet these challenges.
It's time for a renewed, concerted focus on improving science education. We have the tools and resources to do so. Let's pick them up and get to work.
Okay, I'm so excited for our next speaker and our next speaker because both of them have the distinction of being Teachers of the Year, both in big states, important states, and nationally. And it's going to be a really amazing conversation, I think. Now for a first-hand account from Autumn Rivera, 6th grade science teacher at Glenwood Springs Middle School in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. As I said, she just won Colorado's 2022 Teacher of the Year Award, is now up for the National Teacher of the Year Award. Autumn, congratulations, a really big welcome to you. I don't know if you know that after our discussion, I have Johanna Hayes, representative from Connecticut, who actually won Teacher of the Year in her state, and then she did win Teacher of the Year nationally. And so maybe this is kind of a good omen, or maybe we're screwing it all up, I don't know. But congratulations to you. I'm excited about this because I'd love to hear about how you approach your obsession, which is students and teaching, and how you approach that, which is interesting. I'm also interested as you kind of look at it, because again, using today as a show and tell, what are the things that you think you've stumbled across and you've done that other teachers that are trying to find a way might think about doing as well?
Well, first, Steve, thank you so much for having me. And I would like to correct the two governors. The correct answer is frozen Samoas, if we're going to talk about the best way to have a Girl Scout cookie. And I think one of my big passions about being an educator, I've been in education for 17 years, and I really want to find a way to have my students have a voice now. So many times we have our students think about the future, whether it's the next grade level or it's the next class when they get to high school or college. And we never really allow our students to have a chance to make a change now in the present. And so one thing I really focus my teaching on is allowing students to advocate and empower their voices to make a change for what's happening, what they see right now. Because when students are able to have that empowerment right now, then they're better prepared for the future. And so it's been really an awesome situation. My students were actually able to rally around saving a local lake. A couple years ago, they decided they wanted to help a land trust purchase this lake. And so they did a big sale and we sold t-shirts, and they were able to raise over $1,000 to put towards this. And their advocacy was really powerful. And just last October, actually, Governor Polis announced it to be the 43rd state park in Colorado. And so just having those students be able to have that voice is really powerful. And I just encourage all teachers to continue to do that.
Well, look, I don't want to let that go, because I think what you just said just has an incredible, what you're doing is helping to introduce purpose, right? Introduce purpose into the classroom and hearing what people, these young people want their purpose to be. I don't think I'm speaking out of line if I say that a lot of teachers in the past, and maybe we've kind of over-typified in certain, sometimes teachers feel like they're asked to become the parents, they're asked to become the disciplinarians, they're asked to carry the load for so many different dimensions that, the space to find what you just have figured out how to get the chemistry right on purpose is really hard to do when kids don't feel secure or they have a lot of other issues going on. So I guess my question to you is, what's the secret pattern that you've put in place that we can understand about? You just talked about it so easily. I think some teachers find themselves in very different circumstances.
Yeah, it is a lot. Teaching is a lot right now, especially in the last year, I think has been the hardest year and an unexpected hard year for all of us as teachers. 2020 and 2021, we sort of knew that it was going to be hard and we prepared ourselves and we were ready to move forward. However, at the beginning of this year, it's been way more difficult than I've ever experienced. And I see the same with my coworkers. But I think the most important thing to do right now is to pause and just get to know your students, get to know their interests, really understand who they are and put students first. Current national finalist, Kurt Russell, with me, always talks about the importance of putting students first, and students are the centerpiece. And I just echo that message, because I think students are so important, and understanding where they are, seeing their interests, not only just helps you have a better relationship and allows those students to feel safe, But then as I move forward in deciding where my classroom is going to go, I'm able to shape my instruction around what they're interested in. And for example, with the Sweetwater Lake, students were really interested in that. And so I was able to have that ability and support from my administration to move forward and support my students. But if I hadn't taken the moment to get to know my students and built an inclusive environment where all students feel like they belong and they matter, it wouldn't have happened. And so just really encouraging teachers and just community members to rally around your community, around your schools, to support all of your students and really get to know them and celebrate who they are.
You know, are there other things that you're experimenting with on that front around the lake? I mean, it reminds me of a case I knew where Salesforce Corporation was working in partnership with some schools and, you know, teaching young people to code. And what they were doing with the coding, interestingly, was measuring microplastics in local lakes and local, you know, waterways and whatever. And the results were shocking, actually. And these young people were very much in the middle of it, and they were, you know, using science to basically tell a story, and then feeling connected to real world things. It was incredibly powerful for me to see that. But as we kind of talk about, you know, some of these innovations that are out there, you know, we talked to some, you know, with Governor Sununu about summer camp grants, or look at what folks were, you know, supporting mental health aid, or, you know, creating optional days at school. Are there other, I don't want to call them innovations, but adjuncts to that we should be considering to complete the education experience for those students that have gone through the last 2 years?
Yeah, I really think it's important to reach out to the community and really help bridge that gap between the community and the schools. I know I have been really awesome and able to work with Denver Museum of Nature and Science in Denver, Colorado, and also with STEM is My Future in Grand Junction, Colorado. Those two have been amazing informal education programs that are able to support our students and really work with our teachers to help provide other situations. I think having that environment is really important. I also think so many times we hear this discussion on learning loss and how we need to support our students in the loss that they learned. But I challenge back that our students did not lose any learning. They shifted what they learned. Like, yes, maybe they didn't get the science that I wanted them to get over the course of the last 2 years. But you know what they did get? They learned how to learn online. They learned how to learn in person, sometimes both. They learned how to protect themselves. I think they all have graduate degrees in technology at this point. And so really celebrating that. And I really challenge us to use the wording learning shift, because our students have shifted in what they've learned. They haven't lost anything. And I think celebrating what our students have done and using that to move forward is really going to help us move into this next step in education.
Right. Well, we may want to go a notch more on that, because we've got a question for you from the audience that touches on that. But from Autumn Rivera, from Paige Rander. Paige? Autumn, sorry.
Hi, my name is Paige Rander, and I'm a former trustee in Clear Creek ISD in Lake City, Texas, outside of Houston. My question today is for the educators. I'd like to know what has been your experience with learning loss with our students. Is it real? And if so, what can parents do to be responsible partners in helping educators overcome this challenge?
Paige, great question, and I'd love you to go a notch further on that, because you've already touched on a bit.
Yeah, I do think really recognizing what our students went through during our lockdown and what that was like. I know as a middle school teacher, I watched some of my students already in middle school. There's the random gap in maturity levels that we all can remember fondly when we were in middle school. However, during the pandemic, where students were not around each other, that ability to sort of learn with your peers through just maturity kind of stopped. And so we now have an even bigger gap between that. And so I think finding ways to just support our students and support our teachers. I love parents. I want them to come in. I want them to help. I think, again, celebrating what your students have done, what your children have done, talking about those different methodologies and allowing our students to take a breath. I think they've been through a lot, but they're really resilient, and just thinking what they've learned through this last couple years and celebrating that and finding ways to move forward, making sure students are talking about it, processing. I think sometimes our students haven't really had a chance to process what's happened in the last few years, so allowing that to happen. And then taking these different gems that we've seen. Like, I know my students now are able to communicate their learning through technology in ways they never have before, and it's such an exciting thing to see. And having students be able to celebrate that and finding different gems that we have from before and finding different gems that we have now and sort of looking how we're going to move forward. And having parent involvement in that is amazing. I think that support, going into schools, helping out in any way that you can. I know a lot of our schools right now are struggling with different guest teachers. And so having come in and help cover a teacher's class so they can do different things and help support their students. But through that teamwork is how we're going to move forward.
Well, Autumn Rivera, 2022 Colorado Teacher of the Year, and she's a finalist for the National Teacher of the Year. Good luck with that, and just whatever happens with that, I just really appreciate your thoughts, very thoughtful ideas on education today. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you'll come back. Let me know, get my email address, send me, somehow team, let me know if she wins, okay? If she doesn't win, you know, we'll all celebrate anyway.
It's great either way. Just to be a finalist is amazing, and thank you so much for bringing this out there, and just encourage people to listen to the teachers. We're the experts. We know we're in the classroom, so keep listening to the teachers.
Thank you so much. So our next guest is Democratic Congresswoman from Connecticut's 5th District, Jahana Hayes. I'm a little upset at Jahana Hayes, actually, folks, because I've interviewed her before, and you did not drop on me that you were the 2016 National Teacher of the Year. I mean, I knew you had been a teacher, but I didn't know you were like a big deal teacher. So it's really great to be with you. I don't know what we're talking about, but it's I loved our conversation last time, but this was not part of the deal. So, you know, I know that you are working, Representative Hayes, on the questions of what can we do to be supportive of teachers who are on the front line. As we think about, you know, labor shortages and the labor gap in this country, you know, we talk about men and women with children at home and you know, with the issues of childcare and how difficult it is to get out, that across the board, we've got gaps and shortages across this country in lots of job areas. So you're trying to lighten the load, help it. Tell us about your concerns about teachers on the front line today, because I got to tell you, when I talk to superintendents, there is a lot of problems with retention right now.
Well, thanks for having me back. And I think the answer to my question is exactly what you just said. The reason why you didn't know that I was the National Teacher of the Year the last time we spoke is because with teachers, it's never about the teachers. It's always about the students and the learning and what we can do to invest in our children and the next generation of leaders. And that is something that I think it's not just teachers, just across all communities. People forget about the people who are actually doing the work and being put in front of children. So as we think about the impacts of this pandemic and what the last 2 years have meant for educators, we have to think about, you know, the emotional well-being of teachers, about making sure that they are supported in their classrooms. One of the first pieces of legislation that I introduced at the beginning of this pandemic was Save Education Jobs Act, because I knew that when school districts were faced with budget cuts and restraints and constraints, the first to go would be the guidance counselors, the social workers, you know, the behavior techs, all of those support personnel that help, you know, our academic subject area teachers do the work that they need to do. All of those people, the school nurses, are a part of the school community. We have legislation to raise teacher pay, to infuse the educator pipeline by supporting, you know, HBCUs and minority serving institutions, to making sure that when our professionals get in front of our children, they have all of the resources that they need, they have the background to support them. And when they're in the classroom, they have, you know, the administrative and community supports that are necessary. I can tell you it's been painful over the last 2 years to see teachers celebrated as heroes. You know, they're out in communities delivering Chromebooks and textbooks and visiting with their students, and then being blamed for being too lazy to go back and not wanting to reopen the schools when they ask questions about their safety and the safety of their family members. That should not be a parsed conversation. We should be supporting the people that we put in front of our children, because ultimately our kids are the ones who benefit.
You know, I so respect your work on trying to help relieve teacher-student loan debt. I don't know the size of that debt. I know we've been discussing nationally, you know, when we had the presidential election, talking about, you know, student loan debt overall. I know Elizabeth Warren's been working on this, but I hadn't thought about, to tell you the truth, how vital teachers are and that they themselves would have significant student loan debt. And it kind of gets back into this question of, you know, what are we prioritizing in the country? So my question to you is, how's the reception to that be? I mean, I think if President Biden and a couple of Republicans and a couple of Democrats came out and said this would seem to be an easy one to get. Am I wrong?
Nothing is easy here. And I'm so happy you brought that up, because it was one of the things that I was criticized in my campaign for carrying student loan debt. And I thought, but I just wanted to be a teacher and I wanted to go to school. And having been the first in my family to go to college, the only way for me to do that was to take on Pell Grants and student loans. In this administration, we were able to increase the amount of Pell Grants, and I just introduced legislation so that teachers, educators could simultaneously enroll in public service loan forgiveness. But just for a greater appreciation of this, I taught in the state of Connecticut, and in my state, you had to have a master's degree in order to maintain teacher certification. So within the first 5 years of teaching, I had to go on and get a master's degree. So, you know, and I went to community college, I went to state university, and then public university. So nothing extravagant. But by the time I finished, I came out with almost $70,000 in student loan debt for a job that was going to start me off at $31,000. So if we're going to attract the most highly qualified professionals to this field, we have to do something different. There are so many people, when you're looking at, you know, in the STEM fields, people with advanced science and math degrees, these highly specialized professionals. And I saw at my school when we were trying to recruit people for, whether it be IT personnel, you know, to teach in our business department, or automotive personnel to teach, you know, in our trades department. It was always difficult to attract those professionals because they could always find more money in the private sector. And I remind people, teaching is not mission work. This idea that the love of teaching and the love of children is enough to fuel, you know, educators to stay in the classroom. I've seen so many of my peers and colleagues and friends in education who, as a result of this pandemic, have just had to leave because they can no longer sustain their own family. I've seen teachers, when they start a family of their own and have children, have to leave the classroom because they can't find affordable childcare for themselves. These are all the things that we need to consider when we talk about investments in education. Just making sure that the people who are making the decision, I mean, are not martyrs, if you will. But we have to. I'm excited that this administration, that the Secretary Cardona is really taking seriously the conversation about what are we doing to support and attract people, because otherwise we'll only end up with educators in the classroom where money's not an issue, where, you know, they had a family that could send them to college. And what we need is everyone. We need people from all backgrounds, all walks of lives in front of our students. And for someone like me, again, being the first in my family to go to college, I relied on student loans. I relied on Pell Grants. So there has to be, until we figure out how to make higher education more affordable, there has to be a way that is sustainable for educators.
You know, that one of the things that, you know, strike me, you know, you're a high school teacher, as you said, first educated. You know, you're known for saying education saved your life. You're now a member of Congress, you know, which most people look at as a pretty good deal. You know, I don't know if you heard my conversation with Charlene Russell Tucker, the commissioner for the state of Connecticut, Department of Education. We have Mikhail Cardona, also from Connecticut. Connecticut's kind of in the game here a lot, and I'm fascinated by that because I don't think we designed it. But it does mean that something within the educational ecosystem of Connecticut seems right, that seems impressive, that whatever. And I guess in a way not bragging, but basically looking at, you know, what can we shore up by way of how education has real traction in people's lives. Because I look at education today as a politically stressed out subject, like crazy politics right now in education. I'm just interested in how we get on a constructive track in a state as opposed to the stressed out, exhausted state that I see in much of the country. I don't know if you have any insights into that, but would love to hear.
Well, let me start by saying Connecticut is definitely in the game. And there is a through line between the folks that you just mentioned, Commissioner Russell Tucker and Secretary Cardona, and it is that we all are of the community in which we served. Secretary Cardona was in the Meriden Public Schools, was a school administrator, was a teacher, was a principal, and then went to work for the state of Connecticut. Same with Dr. Russell Tucker. I worked in, and when I say education saved my life, I absolutely mean it. In the public housing complex the projects that I grew up in, many of my friends, many of the people I grew up with just have not had good outcomes, died, have gone to jail, are addicted on some level to drugs, have just had a rough life. So I credit everything that has happened to me with just being invested in an education, with supportive teachers and community members that saw something in me. And I think that's why it is so important to get people who are of these communities back in our schools in front of people. It made all the difference at my school that I was from that city, that I had lived there, that I had grew up there. It helped me to connect to young people and was encouraging and uplifting for them as they struggled to find their way and their footing. The same thing with the other people that you just mentioned. So really getting people not only to choose a profession of education, but then also choose to return to their communities. Because for me at my school, there were so many people who lived in the outskirts, commuted in, and just had a very different perspective on the students that we served. So as we get more and more of people from those communities, and most of them are in the highest need communities. When I was named the National Teacher of the Year, I had job offers from everywhere, from all over the state, from just education, just different stakeholders in education. And I chose to stay in my school district. I wanted to work at the Waterbury Public School, and my kids would ask me all the time, or say to me all the time, "You picked us." And, I assured them, yes, absolutely, I picked you. So we have to do more to infuse the pipeline, to encourage people who are the most highly qualified to work in our most challenging school districts. And I think that in Connecticut, that has happened a lot. People are invested in their communities. There is a different level of investment in equity and the challenges that we face. And I think that is something that we have to get as part of the national policy conversation. When I think about education, I don't think about it as political. I think about it as just our responsibility. It is policy. It is making the financial investments that are necessary to support student academic success, to support educators, to close the achievement gap, to close the equity gap on the physical spaces that people are learning in. All of those things are just real and important to me because I know the consequences of inaction. And I am fortunate that I come from a state where I had so many tremendous partners in doing this work.
Let me ask you finally, Representative Hayes, completely off subject, but I think it is on subject in certain ways, which is civil society, thinking about what, educating our children about, democracy, civics, all the struggle over what that means. And you were, in the room, so to speak, when President Zelensky of Ukraine spoke the other day. And I'm just interested, as you talk to your constituents, do they care about Ukraine? Do they feel connected about what's going on? How were you moved or not moved by President Zelensky's comments the other day?
My constituents absolutely care about what is going on in Ukraine. And again, we have a moral responsibility to help our neighbors. I think that we were traveling down a dangerous path where, every man for himself. And, as long as my family is okay, I don't care what is happening to my neighbor. And then we got hit with a global pandemic where we recognized that we are all interconnected. One of the reasons that I was selected as National Teacher of the Year is because I created a club called the Hope Club, which was called Helping Out People Everywhere. It was an acronym, and it was a volunteer service club. And the goal of this club was to take kids who had from in a Title I inner city urban public school district, kids who had spent their entire life on the receiving end of aid, and show them that they too could be the givers. That was important to me. And as a result, they started to thrive academically. And, you know, the work that I was doing in the classroom and at my school got noticed on a national scale. That is a much smaller example, but it kind of has the same through line that, you know, we have a responsibility, especially in education, to use our gifts or to be of service, to provide help to other people. President Zelensky's message was just that, you know, that he said something that was, I mean, so incredibly powerful for me. He said, I am almost 45 years old. He said, but my heart stopped beating when the hearts of 100 children in Ukraine stopped beating, you know, and the images of civilians and children just being brutally killed is something that the global community has a moral responsibility to respond to. I am deeply troubled by what is happening, but also I think that it reminds us that we have to stay engaged at all times in global diplomacy. We have to be partners on the world stage. We cannot have this, you know, America alone agenda where we ignore the challenges of other countries, because this is what we end up with at our doorstep. So I think that the world has been put on notice that our humanity is all intertwined, and we have a responsibility to step in when human rights are violated anywhere in the world.
Well, listen, you know, I started this conversation, it's very powerful, and thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's just, it's hard to not get emotional. I am emotional, but I guess this, I started off frustrated with you that you and I didn't know this cool stuff about you. I just want you to know we're cool now. We're back to even. So Jahana Hayes, representative in the U.S. House of Representatives from Connecticut, 2016 National Teacher of the Year Award. It was so great to have you on right after Autumn Rivera, who's up for that potential distinction as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad I can make it right.
Thank you. So our last panel of the day is a really exciting one where we're going to focus on foundational academic discipline and science education. Dr. Bernard Harris is the CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative. He was also the first African American to complete a spacewalk as a veteran astronaut and has logged more, this is ridiculous, he's logged more than 438 hours. And like, who's counting, but he's traveled 7.2 million miles in space. So that's a big number. Dr. Margaret Honey is the president and CEO of the New York Hall of Science, a museum founded during the 1964-65 World's Fair. That sounds really cool, and I need to visit. You saw her earlier in this segment produced by this event sponsor, The Collaborative, but I wanted her here to have my own discussion with her. And finally, Dr. Stephen Pruitt is the president of the Southern Regional Education Board, which works with states to improve education at every level. He's also a former Kentucky State Commissioner for Education. In the interest of transparency, the Southern Regional Education Board also acts as one of the many expert reviewers for the sponsor of today's event, which I look as a great thing. Well, let me just ask you, I'm going to start with Dr. Pruitt before we get to 7.2 million miles in a great museum. But I am interested, you know, part of our talk today is there are a lot of little boutique stories around in the country. There are great teachers out in the country. There are innovative things that are going on that I see left and right. You know, I just got back from South by Southwest in Austin, and I saw lots of cool things. I'm interested in what we've learned so that you can create a playbook of best and promising practices in education, particularly recovering from this era of COVID and the impact. And so I'm interested in how you rationalize the information and feedback. So, you know, Dr. Pruitt, Stephen, you know, what are some of the elements of that are really key to this conversation we have today?
Well, I'd say that one of the first things to think about is the fact that you have to think about all of this stuff in totality. There's not the opportunity for us to think about pieces of things. Now, we can take pieces of things and build them up, but as science people, we know that anytime you affect one part of a system, it affects another part of the system. So having things that actually think more than, say, for instance, just buying laptops for people to have one-to-one. Well, you got to think bigger than that. You got to think about how are we going to sustain this over time. I think, unfortunately, one of the things in education that we tend to do is look for silver bullets. Silver bullets only work for werewolves. You actually have to think about this more deeply, and you have to think about how are we going to make sure that we sustain this over time. So when we're looking at the promising practices that are going on in the South, what we're looking for is not the one shot. Not just a remediation that would help somebody pass a test, but actually what would help that person become the better version of themselves as a learner that would sustain them over time.
Well, thank you for that. And Dr. Harris, I'm kind of blown away by the 7.2 million miles. Did you feel every mile, or did they just rush by? But more seriously, look, I think one of the questions I was asked earlier is what is the state of, what is the health, the state, the anchorage, if you will, of science education in this country today? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it in a wobbly way? What is your perspective?
Well, I think that we're doing it, right? And we're doing it individually based on the communities that are being addressed. I think in general, there are STEM deserts around the country that we need to address. And that's something that we're trying to do at the National Math and Science Initiative, is to raise the level of high quality STEM education and insert that into our traditional educational systems, whether they're in the cities or in the rural areas, to make sure that our young people are going to be competitive. I think Dr. Pruitt kind of mentioned earlier that we have to look at this thing as a whole. And being a guy that has seen the world from a different perspective, we're no longer competing as a country, we're competing with the rest of the world. And so we have to make sure that our students are prepared for that new way of doing business.
Well, before I jump to Dr. Honey, let me just ask you a question. And maybe this is my own pet peeve, but I did a series of events around the nation at one point with a large manufacturing operation. And we went to Ohio, went to Pennsylvania, went to Massachusetts, went to different parts. I interviewed the governors in each of these states, and we looked at the partnerships with local community colleges and things we were trying to do to sort of revive STEM education, kind of look at engineering, even look at manufacturing, around which a lot of these pieces were part of the ecosystem. But I heard over and over and over again that there was stigma related to those students that were thinking they might become engineers because so many lost their jobs in sort of the great hollowing out. We as a nation are talking about reshoring a lot of things, bringing a lot of manufacturing back, looking at high tech. And I'm wondering, this is a discussion I haven't seen anybody have, is this an opportunity to go back to these families that felt cheated, if you will, in terms of opportunity, where their families were, and then try to say, hey, we ought to have a national campaign. We ought to kind of go out and remind people that this is a strength, not a weakness. I don't know if that makes sense, but I have to tell you, it was palpable in these former manufacturing communities that I was in around the country, and their disappointment, 2 decades ago, that pathway ended up being a dead end.
Well, I think things have changed now. We're in the 21st century where technology is driving everything that we do, in engineering, and particularly education and STEM is going to be critical to that equation. So, I used this the other day as an example, being a space guy, looking at what's happening on the commercial side in terms of new private industry being involved in this. And the question was, why are folks interested in going into space and orbiting platforms? And then said, well, that's because that's the future. So when we think about jobs, they're not going to be just manufacturing jobs. By the way, the manufacturing jobs that are required these days require expertise in math and science. They're technical jobs. They're not the manual jobs of the old. And so that's happening here on Earth, but in space, we're going to have a whole new industry that gets developed in low Earth orbit and beyond. And some of our kids are not only going to get up in the morning and go to a job here on Earth, but they're going to go up and maybe get on a shuttle and go up to an orbiting platform. That is the future that we need to be prepared for.
Dr. Honey, I have not been to the New York Hall of Science, and I hope you're going to invite me because I get up to New York a lot and I sound fascinated. But I did recently interview Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie is the 13th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and he said, look, we have a job both to kind of create things that are aspirational, that help broaden the horizons of people. We also have to reflect who we are as a nation. Our people have to see themselves in our institutions. How are you accomplishing that in the New York Hall of Science? What's that lift that you're trying to create as particularly young people encounter science through what you do?
Yeah. One of the great things about running a science center or science museum is that we have degrees of freedom to be creative and exploratory in ways that I think can be really challenging in a school environment. And what that looks like in our environment is that science is highly experiential. It's hands-on. We design experiences so that young people are given opportunities to ask questions, to use and also to use the tools of science for exploration and discovery. And I think one of the greatest travesties, I would call it, of our current education system, particularly at the elementary level, is not only is science an afterthought, so far too many children are not even getting exposure to scientific ideas, but we teach it as a memorization exercise. We don't teach it as a domain of inquiry and problem solving and question asking and all of the skills that are essential in today's world. And that's criminal because we could, and there are, as you mentioned at the outset, there are examples all over the country of teachers and school districts doing this well. I think we need to build on and scale those examples of effective practice up and make them accessible for all children.
Yeah, I guess, before I jump back to Scott Pruitt, I just want to ask this question, which is, I'm familiar with the history. I was very young at the time it happened. I actually wasn't alive maybe when Sputnik went up, but it kind of drove basically a person's individual insecurity about being behind, at that time, the Russians, in space exploration, that we had, engineers popping up and rocket scientists in West Virginia, that we had a whole wave of science basically take over. I'm just wondering, in not a silly way, whether we need to somehow recreate that sense of tension and challenge and competition and understand it. I see it out there myself, but I don't know out in regular American society whether there is a sense of insecurity that might drive greater commitments and investment. Is that a silly thing? And Dr. Honey, I would just love to hear whether that's something you think, because part of it is critical reasoning, all the problem-solving skills, thinking ahead was what we did back then. I just don't know how we get back to that today.
Well, it's not silly at all. That kind of aspiration, that vision, that realization of, stretching yourself and taking a leap and making it possible. I mean, it's still alive and well today. What we don't have is a nation united behind that vision. And, sadly, we've seen that during the pandemic that so many of our fellow citizens are skeptical of science. They don't trust it. They don't believe in it. And honestly, I think that has a lot to do with the very anemic state of science education in this country. And there's a tremendous amount of work we have to do to change that.
Bernard, I saw you jumping out of your chair on that one before I jumped to Dr. Pruitt. Did you want to say something?
Oh, certainly. I think she is exactly right. We do need a Sputnik moment. We need a national initiative, a campaign around STEM education to raise the bar of expectations of our young people. I have to remind people when the pandemic happened, who were the folks that came up with the remedies, came up with the vaccines? They were scientists. They were educated folks in STEM. And so if we are going to move forward as a nation, as a people on this earth, we've got to make sure that this type of education is for everyone, right? We talk about equity. We need to make sure that happens. But, we have communities in inner city that are not getting the education that they need, particularly the science education that they need. There are areas in the rural areas that also need that. We just started something we called an education learning accelerator in Alabama to address issues like this, where we're actually educating teachers on how to become better STEM teachers. And it's working.
Wow, that's great. Stephen Pruitt, I in every organization I've been affiliated with that failed, I realized that it was because they worried about the wrong things. And the ones that succeeded were the ones who were able to discipline themselves to worry about the right things. And I think we're discussing, one of the things of how do you get focus and attention and priority about the right things and get education off working on the wrong things. So you were, Kentucky State Commissioner of Education, you were a chemistry teacher, you're now president of this, big education board and kind of doing this stuff. I'd love to get your insights on how we systemically, it's a big ship, but how do we begin to move a system or seduce these, dissonant parts of the system and to begin prioritizing the right things, if that's the right, and you can challenge my framing, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I sort of feel like that's what we're talking about.
Well, it's hard to, it's pretty easy to oversimplify actually, because education is not rocket science, because actually rocket science may be a little easier, with all due respect, Bernard. You got all these complexities of human beings. I would say that the first thing is to recognize that we have a single system from K through the workforce. When we start thinking about these things in pieces, then we often kind of twinkle around the edges, but we don't have a full systemic view of how to shift a system. One of the biggest things is we've got to set a goal for where we want to be over the next 10, 20 years. The workforce is changing so significantly. Bernard hit on this. We're predicting in the South that if we don't do a better job of science education, STEM education, this is hit on in the National Academy's call to action, for instance, that we may see 18 million unemployable adults by 2030 because they don't have the technical skills to be involved in a workforce that is so reliant on scientific thinking. And so we've got to set a goal first of where we want to get. And then from there, we have to start to evaluate what do the systems need to do to align to ensure that as students move from one place to another, that they are actually getting what they need to be successful at that next level. We actually have to stop thinking about teaching science for science sake or teaching STEM for STEM sake. The reason is because we simply will not have people who can be involved in a workforce by 2030 based on where we're going. So basically what I'm saying is you can't work like the Jetsons if you're thinking like the Flintstones. We actually have to really reevaluate where we are now. And we have the opportunity coming out of COVID to recognize that each state and our country need to think, what do we want our workforce to look like? Now let's align all of our systems, K-12, post-secondary, workforce, so that we can actually help our country continue to be the great economic power that it is.
Well, look, we're going to take a question from the audience. I'm going to do my little editorial. I do a ton of events and programs on science. I believe it's such a priority for the nation. Today's discussion, we're talking about young people, education, COVID. I'm very glad we have. I hope all three of you will come back when I'm doing a program on science and the science infrastructure in this country. Glad it's part of this discussion, but come back and be part of these other discussions too. It might be very rewarding. But we do have an audience question from Brigitte Blom. Brigitte?
Good afternoon. My name is Bridget Blum. I'm the president and CEO of the Pritchard Committee for Academic Excellence in Kentucky. My question for the panel: deep education reform is now nearly 40 years old in our nation, and improvements have certainly been made. Yet we still lag other countries, and there's growing division between traditional standards-based reform and deeper learning. How to measure and what to measure? How do we coalesce around a way forward that results in the US's continued improvement in education by state and our standings internationally? Thank you.
Bridget, that was a perfect question. I probably should have asked an hour ago, so great. Thank you so much for it. But let me start out. Stephen Pruitt?
Well, hi, Bridget. Good to see you again, being a fellow Kentuckian there. I kind of go back to what I was saying before. I really think that part of our problem is when we think about a K-12 system, a post-secondary system, and a workforce system, just so scientifically speaking, systems compete. They compete for resources, They compete for anything that helps that system survive. I think until we start to realize that when we make changes in K-12, it affects post-secondary, until we realize that we have a workforce that is changing so drastically that we can't afford to not have that. I think we got to really, the whole idea of reform really needs to be about how does the system need to respond to a specific issue. And for me, that biggest issue is going to be the workforce and the economy. STEM has got to be widened. It's not going to be just engineers and just doctors anymore. It's going to be welders, advanced manufacturing. It's going to be even carpentry. I mean, those skills are going to be really critical. So to me, to change that means that we've got to reevaluate the whole system. That means that when we're looking at assessment, it means we've got to look at more individualized assessment. We've got to look at assessment that allows a student who loves welding to be able to show their math proficiency possibly in a more unique way than currently sitting at a table taking a test. I personally believe in state assessments, but I think that we could do a lot better job with those. But at the end of the day, it's about recognizing that if these systems don't shift in our southern region, as I said, we can't afford to have 18 million unemployable adults based on where we're headed.
Right. Well, thank you. And Margaret, I should have asked you before, is it Dr. Honey or Dr. Honey?
It's Honey.
Honey, okay,
H-O-N-E-Y.
great. Well, Margaret Honey, Dr. Margaret Honey, love to get your thoughts on, not only what we measure, but I mean, Bridget raised this very interesting point about, remembering, as Bernard Harris just said, there's another world out there that we've got to benchmark ourselves with. They're investing. You go to India, you go to China, there are a lot of PhDs in engineering and science and math and biotech and all that stuff. So I'm just interested in how you would respond to her.
Yeah, it was a great question that Bridget asked. And I would point first and foremost to a fact, which we need to keep repeating over and over and over again, which is those countries that have invested significantly in their education system have first and foremost invested in their educators, in their teachers, in their workforce to ensure that they have high quality, well-trained and well-supported people in the classroom. They don't believe in programs that train teachers up in 6 weeks and send them into our most challenging schools. They believe in and they invest in ensuring that they are bringing the best professionals into the classrooms that they can. So that's one. Two, I think we need high quality, creative, as Stephen and Bernard were saying, student-centered materials that, enliven and enrich what learning can be for young people. It can be magical. Come to my museum. You'll see it happening every day here. It is magical, right? And the third issue, which Stephen touched on as well, is we absolutely need to change our assessment systems. They need to be more performance-based. If we have assessments that are just asking you to spit out and regurgitate facts, we are going to be guaranteed that we are going to bore kids to death in classroom settings, and they will choose to opt out. And too much of science education is taught that way now. If we could sort of get those three core ingredients right, our people, our resources, and the tools we use to evaluate student performances, we could change the game. It's not rocket science. It's actually doable. And we know it's doable because there are pockets all over the country that are doing it and doing it well.
And Bernard, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to add this element. In Austin, these last few days at South by Southwest, in between great movies and films we're doing and great comedy shows and great music, the other experiences were all built around space, high tech, virtual reality and augmented reality. They were science and math created and crafted environments of the future. And so when I think about a National Math and Science Initiative, I saw elements of that in this pop culture scene, and would just love, as you reflect on this question of what we should measure and how we compare, are there kind of green sprouts in this conversation at somewhere like South by Southwest and elsewhere that are going to help us along?
So when I'm talking to young people, and talking to educators. And I think Dr. Honey hit on something that I'm really sensitive about, and that is that we don't give our teachers their due. They are the future. They hold in their hand the best investment that this country can make, and that is our young people. So we do need to support them. We need to also connect the dots. And so I've been to South by Southwest, and I can't think of a better platform. There are others that are out there that actually highlight technology and where we're headed to actually connect the dots for our students. Well, that's good for you and I to go to South by Southwest, but how does that word get down to the students that need to hear that message?
Right.
So we need to work on that too, which I think is important. Because if we don't do that, they don't see how science and STEM is relevant to what they're doing. Now, I always have to remind them that the technology that they love working on, these devices that we have was done by a knowledgeable person in STEM. And if they are looking for the best paying jobs will be in STEM, despite anything else that, that we say. And so that's important. It's already been said by Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Honey that this needs to be an integrated solution, starting at pre-K all the way up through college. We have something we call vertical teaming, and that is the teachers in elementary school need to know what the teachers are going to teach in middle school and high school and beyond, so that we end up connecting the dots, And that is, wasn't expecting that to happen.
We've been trying to reach you concerning your car's extended warranty.
Oh my God.
You should have received something in the mail about your car's
All right,
extended
so much for that.
warranty.
So
we have
anyhow,
not gotten a response. We are giving you a
it is so
final
important
call
for us
before we close out
to
your file.
get these messages
That's
out.
why to speak with someone about
Well, thank you for that. Well, listen, I want to thank Dr. Bernard Harris, who is not only CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative, but I just computed it out, if I'm right, that the 7.2 million miles he's gone in 438 hours in space means he went 16,438 miles an hour on average. So you can play around with me if I'm right or wrong about that, but that's pretty good. And I want to thank Dr. Margaret Honey, President and CEO of the New York Hall of Science. I hope you'll let me visit. And Dr. Stephen Pruitt, President of the Southern Regional Education Board. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great conversation, and I look forward to having more.
Thank you for having us.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. What a great set of conversations. A very big thank you to the Collaborative for Student Success for their support. Really great conversations. Thanks to all of you attendees for joining us for these discussions, and for any of you who missed this. And like I said, I think this show's going to have some shelf life. I think there's some good show and tell in this. So show your friends, tweet this out, share it with folks who are interested in how we're measuring what we're doing in education today with the dollars that are coming in. How are we kind of approaching science and kind of building up some of the wobbly parts of the American educational system? We're going to have all of these videos up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.